Cubase 14 gains modulators. So this is a feature which is only available in the upper echelons of Cubase's product line. So, you know, mere mortals, this is not for you, unfortunately, because I actually think this is a really great feature. As you'll see in this video, gives a lots of potential, lots of expandability, etc. So let's take a look. So here we are in Cubase Pro, because that's the only one that has modulators in. And first things first, we're just going to look at a quick demo of the modulators just in action, and then we'll go through all the features in hopefully some depth. So I've got an audio track here. It's just an ambient guitar loop from Media Bay. You get the vibe. And let's say we just want to apply effectively tremolo. We're just going to alter the volume. It's really easily done with a modulator. Yeah, you could do it. Back in the day, you'd open this up, you'd go, let's get a sine wave, and then we'd draw in a sine wave, and then you'd change your speed, and it'd be a lot of faffing about. This is much, much easier than that. So we're just going to go to an LFO. We're not going to worry about the speed of it at this point because it's ambient apart from anything else. And then we can click a destination. So this is just a connection to some part of Cubase. So I'm just going to pre-open this so it makes it a bit easier. It defaults to being in learn mode. So we're just going to grab this control and that's it. It's now doing that with the volume control. There is a way around this if you don't like the fader going up and down, because certainly some people will find that a little bit problematic. But what we can do as well is, let's say we want to combine that with automation. So I'm just going to bypass that for the moment, and then we can just create some points here. So let's just ramp that. And then if we unbypass it, you can see that if we go from the non-selected part, you can see it's starting out low. So it's combining the two, and then up we come. These kind of controls, if you've used something like Massive, etc., any NI stuff, these will be fairly familiar. So you've got the control amount here and then the basic setting as well. So you can see that the basic setting here is being controlled by automation. So this is the automated value, and then we've got the modulator value, and it's showing you swinging that up and down. So we can just make that less. If we just want a subtle amount, we can do that. You can make it negative, which would change the phase, which we'll see the effect of in a second. And you can also make it unipolar or bipolar. So bipolar is going above and below, so it's up and down. With it in unipolar mode, it just goes up. It doesn't change the range, which I think I like. I'm not sure, but I partly expected that to go that much of an arc, but actually I think it possibly makes more sense that it's like this. You may argue it the other way. So that's the basics of these. We will look at the LFO in a little more depth in a second, but that's effectively how you get started. So if you want the TLDR or TLDW probably, isn't it, then that's it. You can start playing around with this. You can add more destinations. You can have up to 8 connections for each one. You can add more slots. Generally, you get the idea. But now let's look at it in a bit more depth, starting out with the LFO. So the LFO is, as you would expect, a low-frequency oscillator. We've got a couple of ways for it to run. So it can be in musical mode, or it can be in frequency mode. So the moment it's in frequency, now it's in note. Right, this is common to all of these new developments in Cubase. I really don't like the fact that you can't see the value unless you hover over it. This, to me, makes 0 sense. It's like removing the numbers on the control of a plane because you want it to look neater. There's plenty of space here, and if there isn't, you need to redesign it so that you can see both, because I don't know what value that's on. And when I come in here, I want to instantly see that. I don't want to have to put my mouse over it and possibly change the value, etc. It should be on it straight away. This really, really is, as far as I'm concerned, this is a terrible bit of design. Somebody needs to change this, and someone else really needs to realize it's not about how things look to a point. It's about whether or not they're functional. Right, sermon over. That's common to a load of this stuff. It's really, really got my goat. So you can change the values as you'd expect, up to 30-second dotted, right down to 16. So it's quite nice. We've got a really good range here. Let's put it back on, let's say quarters. We've got shape. Now the shape affects this differently. So you've got all these different waveforms. This control behaves differently depending on what you're doing. So here it adds in some kind of modulation with other frequencies. So you can see we're getting sort of an FM effect. And then we've got phase as well. Phase is a little difficult to see on its own. You're not really going to hear the effect of that. So we don't see it when we alter this control here. It's more to do with the output of it, which makes sense. So let's quickly change that. So the first thing is, if it's just free, you will probably get whatever you get. And certainly I found when it's in free mode, I wasn't getting phasing. But if you do sync to project start or MIDI trigger, which we'll see later on, then you do get it. So we're just going to duplicate this track. I'm going to pan this one to the right, and then I'm going to change its phase to 0. And now if we look in the mixer, we can see as one goes up, the other one goes down. If I play them, you will hear, particularly if I unmute it. And before anyone says it, yeah, I know that's basically the same as panning it, but it's potentially slightly differently. But most importantly, it's about seeing the difference between these as they are changing phase. So that's the phase control in action. Let's carry on and look at the rest. Now, waveform-wise, so we've got quite a selection here. So I'm just going to turn shape down and put this back to 0, just to avoid any issues. We've got triangle, sawtooth, pulse. Now, in the case of this, the shape controls the relationship between up and down. So here's 50-50, there it's almost none. So it should be kind of 1, etc. And there it's mostly up. So this control is custom per waveform. So you can see that's making that kind of like phase as well. So it's like a very short triangular pulse. We've got a curve, whether it's sort of convex in that case or concave. We've got sample and hold 1, which is effectively randomness, which is held, and then smoothing on that. And then sample and hold 2, which is, I guess, a different algorithm and allows you to have randomness, which is different on each one. And again, smoothing that out. So a reasonable choice of waveforms, and you can have randomness in terms of phase as well. So you can play around with that to your heart's content, comparing it between different tracks. But we can see here the effect of it. As I said earlier on in the brief overview, you can add other connections, so we can connect it to anything, pretty much anything that you can automate, you can use a modulator on. So here you can see we've got the standard thing, and if we had any insert effects on this particular track, as we do here, we can play around with that, etc. So it's pretty straightforward in terms of that. If you've used automation, you'll get the idea of this, but it means you can create repetitive stuff, you can create more modular stuff, and also, as we will see a bit later on, you can make them interact with each other and do more interesting and complicated things. So while it's not a modular synthesizer and it's not Bitwig, it's a step towards having that kind of thing. And there's a lot of stuff where doing it manually or doing it with automation takes too long and often doesn't get done, whereas here, you can just do it pretty quickly. So that's the LFO. Now let's take a look at another modulator. So this is the shaper, and this lets you draw in waveforms, which is quite interesting. So you see it's got 2 modes, loop or one shot. So you can make it trigger off of MIDI, which we will look at in a second. So in one shot mode, it plays once and then is done. We're going to leave it in loop mode. You can see if you've ever done anything with the pitch shift feature, this will look familiar. So you can draw in parts here, you can curve it. So it doesn't give you the circular handle, but you can actually curve these. There's a variety of presets to play around with. So an ADSR, etc. Kind of standard things you would want as starting points, which you can then include in a flat line, which is always useful. You can play around with and draw in anything that you couldn't get as a waveform from your LFO. So if you've got anything particularly weird choices, this isn't too bad. We've got speed here. So again, you can have it in hertz frequency. Again, I was hesitating because you see note and it's like, well, does that mean it's triggering off a note? No, this is the duration. So again, put the numbers on there and phase. So the standard stuff you've already seen, but being able to draw on your own waveforms, which is nice. We've got grid resolution here and whether it's snapping to it. So you can see previously I had snap on. Now I can move these around. You can change this to, let's say, 16ths and then make it fit. You've got a reasonable amount of stuff here. To create a new point, by the way, you double click. It makes it a little more difficult to even this out because we can't see where the handle is, etc. But you get the idea. Generally pretty good. Again, can be routed anywhere. Now, you've got one-shot mode here. So you can see I've got a MIDI trigger track set up here. So anything where you've got one shot, basically, you can put it in one-shot mode and it will get fired however you choose. I'm going to put it in that. It was in free. I'm going to put it in MIDI. If we put it in sync to project start, you imagine when we play, it will just fire once and then we're done. But I'm going to put it in MIDI mode. And then on my MIDI track, which I'll bring up to make it a little easier to see, here I just need to set my destination. At the moment it's not connected, so you can see it appears as a sidechain MIDI. So it's shaper MIDI. And then when this note comes along, that will get triggered. So we'll go back to that track. I'll make sure this is unmuted. We'll play it. And you see here, it gets fired at that point and away we go. Pretty straightforward and useful. So obviously you could put in more trigger points, etc. You're not limited to one, but you've got a lot of control with this, which I think is pretty nice. The step modulator is another way of creating effectively LFO waveforms. If you've used Short Circuit, my favorite sampler of all time, hopefully it'll be back at some point, you will be very familiar with this kind of thing. You get a certain number of steps which you can choose and then you can draw them in, which is nice. Again, it's a different way of creating unusual waveforms. So, you know, in Short Circuit, it was the only way you could create LFOs, but here you can do pretty much what you want. What I quite like about this is we've got controls to manipulate things really easily. So reverse, we can shift them backwards and forwards, and we can choose whether or not these are rounded off. So with no slope, you literally get these outputs, which will change instantaneously, but you can slope them up, you can slope them down, or you can slope them up and down, and you can choose how much sloping there is in terms of time. So it doesn't control the rate, it controls the amount of time it takes to get to the next step. So you can have that smooth or not smooth or anywhere in between. So I think this is pretty nice in terms of features for a step modulator. Again, we've just got time control here, frequency or notes, and the same triggering mode. So free, sync to project start or MIDI, as you've seen. So you can just trigger this whenever you have a MIDI note, etc. And again, the same number of destinations. So the envelope follower is a different kind of modulator. So the LFO, step modulator, and shaper are basically variations on a theme. They produce a potentially cyclic waveform which you can customize and trigger in a variety of different ways. The envelope follower is the first one which does something different, and it is triggered via audio, as the name suggests. So if we go on it here, we can see we've got the envelope follower, and it's got effectively an envelope, but it is triggered by audio. So I've put this on a track which has got a kick drum. So if I play it, we can see every time that plays, we get the envelope is triggered. So I'm going to turn the volume of this down so it's not super loud. It will still trigger this. So you notice that even when we're all the way down, so even if we got the volume all the way down, this is still triggering, which is, as far as I'm concerned, pretty useful. So this is in a pre-fader listening kind of mode. We've got our controls we can play around with here. So we've got the attack time. So if we turn this up, you can see there's a slope on the attack. If that's all the way down, you see the attack next time it triggers is pretty quick. If we put it up to 100, you see we've got a much more smoothed off time. Put that back, the release here. So if we put it down, you can see that release happens really quickly. And in fact, it's now happening so quickly, you can see the individual events in the kick drum. So you see those waveforms, you see those steps, those are because of this here. So if we zoom in a bit on that, you can see that waveform of the kick drum and it's reflected in that there. So if your release time, it's kind of like smoothing, effectively, it's too short, you get those in there. If we make this really long, we can see that's taking so long. It's never actually getting down, in this case, to 0 because it's taking that long to release, it's getting triggered again. So that's something to keep in mind depending on what you've got going on. Now, the threshold and gain controls, these are kind of interlinked. So what we're going to do is bring down the release so it's a little bit quicker without it being glitchy. And yeah, these work kind of in concert with each other. So if you bring down the gain, we can see the level here is actually reflecting this more closely. So if it's at the normal level, it's saturating the output completely and we're not getting that little drop in level. Whereas if you bring this down, you can see if we get it to the right kind of level, you can see it's reflecting the fact that this gets louder, although probably not quite as much as that. If we whack it all the way up, we've got loads of level there. So if we put this somewhere where it's triggering a little bit more subtly, should we say, as we bring the threshold up, we can see that it's only triggering on that first instant. And if I go all the way up, it's not triggering at all. So you can play around with this and find this behaves more like a normal threshold control, but I found that if I put this back to its default, the threshold, weirdly, if I put it all the way up, it triggers more. So there seems to be some interaction at this point going on between these, which I found slightly confusing initially. So if I avoided 100, it seemed to be slightly better behaved, but certainly turning down the gain allows you to get a better picture of what's going on. And then you can play around with this. So they don't work exactly as I was expecting, and I'll be honest, I scratched my head over them a bit initially. But when you play around with the two in concert, particularly if you reduce the gain so it's not saturating the output, then it seems to make more sense. But I think with these controls, you can probably get kind of what you want. It would be nice if there was a hold control, I think, because sometimes I would want that to stay open for a bit and then release, and then you could trigger this appropriately by changing these. But it's not too bad, but it's definitely not perfect. You can see we get no other controls, and then we can just assign it to wherever. So the envelope follower is going to be kind of useful if you've got an audio effect which doesn't respond to audio. So let's say you had a filter you really liked, but it didn't have a respond to audio or sidechain, etc. So if it hasn't got any of that, you can effectively make it have a sidechain by routing this to the filter frequency and potentially the resonance, etc., with however much you want. And then anything will be in play. So this is one of the strengths of this, is it allows you to make these effects that previously were static reactive without you having to automate everything. So it can take care of a lot of that for you. So this is the macro knob, which seems pretty basic, but actually this is quite useful because it allows you to control multiple parts of a track at the same time. So often you might find, let's say you're doing an EQ where you are bringing up the level of an EQ, but you want to bring down the channel fader so that the tone of it changes, but the overall level doesn't. This you can do straight away. With one thing, you can fine-tune the relationship between the two, because if you've ever tried doing this with automation, you'll know it can be a bit tricky getting the two together. So this makes it much, much easier to do. So let's do exactly that. So what we're going to do is control the EQ and control the volume at the same time. So what we'll do is click that there. We'll click Learn. So we're going to look at the EQ here, and I've got an EQ turned on. I'm clicking Learn. And then I'm going to adjust this control. So it's going to be the gain here. So you can see it's got EQ to gain. And then I'm going to add connection here. And I'm just going to do it on the fader. So again, we're in learn mode, and I've got that there. So now what I want is when the gain goes up, the volume is going to go down. And I can do that by making this negative. I'm going to make both of them unipolar so it's easier to see what's happening. And when I turn this up, you can see one goes up and the other goes down. Now, obviously, we would need to fine tune that so it worked appropriately. But you can see as I push this up, the EQ's going up, that's going down, and it goes down to 0 here. So this is one thing I find slightly weird, is that the 0 point on here is the halfway point on that. But other than that, pretty much makes sense. So if we play this, these settings won't be right. But you can hear it's already kind of ballpark. So we probably want maybe a bit less of a change on the volume, so I can just reduce that a bit. And clearly you could do much, much more with that, but you get the idea. You can do all sorts. We could maybe change the Q of the gain as well, make it work really nicely. But this is an easy way to achieve something that otherwise would be problematic. And then what you can do is you can automate your macro knob. So we could just find it in our list here. Macro knob. And then macro knob. Away we go. And then you could just automate that as I was doing roughly there. You get the idea. Makes everything so much easier. And then say you've got one automation where it is controlling how much you get of it. And then you can fine tune the relationship between them just by altering these controls here. So it's much easier to achieve those complicated things. So there you go. That's the macro knob. Now let's look at the last of the modulator types, which is the scripter. So Modscripter is something which I confess I haven't had enough time to look at for reasons which will be apparent if anybody has seen one of my videos I released recently. So I'm just going to show you this. We're not going to play around with it much, but this gives you access to using script. So it's actually JavaScript or a subset of JavaScript, which allows you to control what's going on. The easiest way to get started with it is to load up a preset. So we can just click load preset, and then we're just going to pick invert because this is dead simple. So what this does is whatever the input is here, it inverts it. So when that's down, you know, when they were down, they were up, and when they were up, they were down, and when they were only halfway up, they were neither up nor down. We've got a script editor here, so you can open this up, and then you can see what is happening here. Now, this one is really, really simple. So you've got, it's returning 1 minus the input value. So if the input value is 1, it's going to return 0. If the input value is 0, it's going to return 1. So that's how it's doing that. So you could play around with this expression here. So I think we could have input value divided by 2. So that's going to do half the input value, and it reflects it straight away. So when I come down here, it's going to go all the way up. When I go down there, it's only going to get to halfway down. So maybe I could change that to 0.5. And then we're going to be there, maybe 0.75, and then it's going to be centered around that. It's inverting around that center, etc. But obviously, there's much more to see than this. If you load up a more complex preset, you will see that there is a lot more available. So if we load up the apply randomness one, we can see we get some controls here. And if we open up the script editor, there's a lot more code in there. As I've said, I've not really had enough time to look into this. JavaScript is not my language of choice. It's always led me to think, oh yeah, I'm getting it, and then I have a head-scratching moment. There is some documentation for this. Hopefully there will be a bit more and maybe a few more examples, but you can see there's much more code in here. We've got these parameters which have been created, so we've got these knobs here, etc. You can see some of it makes sense. So this, for instance, is our destination in terms of time. So you can see all of those are represented here. But there's more to this than I will be able to go through at this point. But if you're into that kind of thing, this is a great opening up of this that's allowing you to do more programming. To be honest, I'm hoping to see this kind of thing for things like the Project Logical editor and the Logical editor. That would be really great, but at the moment that's not the case. But that's the Modscripter. So I'd probably say load up some presets and see if they do anything that you want, because they're certainly going to do things which are not available in the others. So yeah, we're not seeing the Lorenz-Rossier oscillator anywhere else, are we? So again, we've got how that is implemented. Plenty of code. Just change some numbers, see what happens. It will, the worst case scenario is it will stop working. But the Modscripter is something interesting, and say hopefully in future happier times I will get some time to look at this, because this is exactly the kind of thing that I want to spend some time with if I have time to do so. So now let's look at a few other details and intricacies of modulators. The first thing is they're only available in Cubase Pro. I've said this at the beginning and a number of other places. This is one of those features where they've got to obviously differentiate between the Pro version and the lesser ones. Otherwise, people wouldn't pay for the Pro version, would they? If you need this, then Pro is your answer. Secondly, they don't apply to all track types. So I've actually marked them in red here. The 3 track types that I've kind of pointed out: MIDI, you don't get; VCAs, you don't get; and stereo out, they don't get. So you can't have them on there. You can have them on all the others. So you can have them on group tracks, etc., instruments, samplers, and so on. But they do not work on these 3 kind of tracks. I'm a bit disappointed about MIDI, because I thought that would be quite fun, but there we go. Yeah, I'm not sure why they don't apply to the others, but they don't, so we'll just have to deal with it. Now, as you can see here, there are 6 slots available for each modulator, and in addition there are 8 destinations available. As I mentioned earlier on, they are per track. So if you've got a modulator, you want to move the effect to somewhere else, there are ways to do that, but they only apply to the track that they are placed on, even though you can trigger them from an external MIDI, or you can trigger them from audio sidechain as well. In terms of connections, there are 8 available per slot. So I'm just going to load these up so you get the idea. And you see they subdivide into pages here. So I don't need to do the rest of them, but you get the idea. We've got 2 pages of modulators for each one. 8 destinations. That's probably enough, particularly when you've got, another 6 you can do. So you've got a potential of 48 different destinations per track, which should be enough, really, hopefully. In terms of controls here, so we've got the ability to bypass them. So you can bypass one here. You can bypass all of them. So if you've got multiples, so for instance, on the track where we've got these, you can bypass all of them in one go, which is quite useful. We've seen it in a few other places. So if you've got a I don't know what's going on moment, you can do that, which will make it much easier to understand what's going on. And then you can do them individually. We've got side chaining, which is set up in the classic Steinberg way. So if you've ever done any side chaining anywhere, you'll know how to do this. So you just add a side chain source. You pick an audio track or a track which is generating audio. You can choose whether it's pre-fader, etc. Levels. And then, of course, the classic. Remember to turn it on as well, because otherwise it won't work. So when you turn this on, in the case of the envelope follower, it is then triggered by the external audio. It's not triggered by a mix of the internal and external. So if we look here, let's change that to our kick drum. So we've got it on the M follower track. So that will be the only thing which is triggering that now. So when I play this, you'll see, you can see that that was triggered by that, even though we've got it on this channel here. So the side chaining works effectively a bit like the way you would use MIDI. And MIDI track to trigger that. So in this particular case, we've got a utility menu here, so we can remove, rename, duplicate, move it to another slot if you need to reorder things, etc. You can copy those settings. So for instance, if let's just set this to something that's really obvious what's going on. So, up, down, etc. We can copy the envelope follower setting there. And then if we go to another track, we can paste the envelope follower setting. So it makes it reasonably easy to move it between tracks if you want to set up another one. So although they can't control each other, you can get the same effect set up on different tracks. That's something which isn't present on every feature everywhere. So that's quite nice that we've actually got that. We can load, save presets and manage them, etc. We can switch to the B setting. So if you switch to B setting, you can see here, we've switched to the B setting, and then we can switch to the A setting. So if I change that there, we can go to A and B. So by default, the B setting is going to be the same as the A setting was, but then once you start altering it, it's then back there, and you can apply current settings to A and B. So if you just want to make sure it's stuck where you want. So if you want to compare two values, that's one way to do it. That's the kind of thing I'd like to see a graphic just A-B switch here, because I think it'd be a bit easier, and also to see which is currently applied, because you need to see, right, it's saying switch to B, so therefore I'm on A. And then you can activate or deactivate side chaining, which is, yeah, one way of putting it in here, but there we go. So that's just doing the same as this here. Finally, you can pop these out. So with nearly everything that's in the lower zone, you can pop them out. So you can pop them out individually, as we've got here, or you can pop out an entire window of them. If you've got a big screen, or you want to see all these things, or you want to make it look like the control deck of the Starship Enterprise, you can do that. So I remember back in the day, clients used to be really impressed when you had a flying faders desk, and I knew somebody had programmed up a sine wave on the desk, and he used to just sort of inadvertently play that bit of automation, because then people go, wow, this guy really knows what he's doing. He literally had no clue what he was doing on an O2R, but there you go. But he did that because I showed him how to do it. He saved it, and then he used to pull it out every now and then. So if you've got clients who like to see lots of things happening, maybe this is the mode for you. Certainly, if you've got a big screen, it's nice. And also it allows you to see what's going on other modulators on other tracks at the same time. So simultaneously, you can have a load of them visible. Talking of which, the last feature here, which I want to say, is the pin. So here you can pin that the track will be kept. By default, you can see it's following whichever track I've got selected. But if you pin this, as in common with quite a few other features now in Cubase in the lower zone, it stays in place, which is useful if you want to go and do something with another track while keeping these here. So you've got plenty of options as far as that's concerned, which certainly I find nice. And you can swap this here, wherever. So if you want to quickly go to one, it will do that, and it pins it, which is quite nice as well. Now, earlier on, I alluded to the fact there's another way to automate the volume. And the reason is this. Obviously, if you've got a whole load of these going on in your mixer, that may be slightly unsettling. And also, as we've seen, grabbing this control and altering it when it's being altered by a modulator is a bit clunky. There is a way around that. So what we're going to do is to bypass this, so it's no longer doing that, and add into the track the otherwise, why have they made this? Volume tool. Okay, so this is one of the new plugins, and this gives you the option to send your modulator to this rather than that. So it's a pretty simple plugin. So again, we can just learn that. And now it's altering this. So you can see that that has got the same amount of alteration happening to it. But now back in the mix console, we're not seeing that on this particular channel. We're seeing it on here because I've got that on that. So I'm just going to go and just bypass those so we don't see that confusion there. But in the mixer now, even though this is being affected by a modulator and it's going up and down, you don't get the same thing happening here, because on this track here, it's being done in the volume plugin rather than there. So you probably find you want to do that if you're doing volume, unless you like wonky faders and it looking all over the place. But certainly I've found that I don't want that when I'm doing that. I'd much rather have this. So that explains why there's a very simple volume plugin included purely for this. It's not going to be doing anything else. And you're not really missing out if you don't use that for anything else. Now, finally here, I've got an example of a track where I've gone not totally crazy, but what I've done is taken the test generator effect, which is here, and then used the modulators basically to torture it. So what we've got is an LFO controlling the macro knob, and then the macro knob is controlling the frequency and phase of the shaper, and then the shaper is controlling the frequency of this. And as you can see, it's having a fun time. I did this initially to test out whether it could do it, because obviously by default, this, if we just bypass this and put it on a particular value, so let's just go there. When we turn this on, you can see that this is just generating a particular frequency. There is a problem at this point with bypassing being sort of overridden, so that's why we're getting odd behavior with this. I'm told this will be fixed probably by the time you see this, but for a variety of reasons, I'm recording this much earlier than I normally would be, mostly because I think by the time you see this, all going well, I'll probably be hopefully recovering in hospital when this comes out. So if we bypass or unbypass that, you can see what's happening here, you can hear it here, etc. So you know, it's obviously just craziness, but I quite like the fact you can do this. So you can do, this is nowhere near as complex as you can get. You can get much more complicated and wacky. And this obviously is just the test generator. It's not even an interesting synth. It's literally something which normally just produces test tones. But you can play around with this, and by controlling and if you wanted to make this more controllable, you could have another macro knob which would then control the frequency of this. And then let's just stop that for a second. Then you could probably move this to the first slot. So you can see that's been moved to slot 1, and now this is going to be our best control, the thing we're gonna grab hold of, and then we've got and then Cubase crashed. There we go. So there we can see when you control this. Yeah, I'm going to stop that now, but you get the idea. You could create something much more interesting. I literally just played around with this and tried to torture this. So obviously, with an interesting synth, with this sent to multiple different locations, you could get all sorts of things out of it that initially you can't do. So we've got a lot of modulation possibilities with otherwise basic synths. The one caveat to this is not everything responds instantly to these. So I've seen quite a few reports where it's like this particular effect doesn't respond instantly, but Steinberg say that if this is sending out square waves, obviously this isn't, but if you've got something where it changes instantly like that, Steinberg say this is sending out an instant change. So, you know, that would be like an instant change there, but it's up to the effect to choose how quickly it responds to that, because these controls get smoothed by internal algorithms and they vary between effects. So it's one of those things where your mileage may vary depending on what you're doing. I managed to torture this into crashing just now. Hopefully it won't crash by the time the release is out, but this is the kind of thing where there's a lot of stuff going on, and that is actually the first time I've seen a crash, but there we go. But so that's a look at modulators, which I think is a great step forward for Cubase in terms of expandability and making it much more capable in terms of doing interesting things with sound, which after all is what a DAW really should be. Once you move beyond just, I want to record stuff, you want to start doing things that are interesting. And there's a lot of things that you potentially would do if they were easy enough, but when they become a pain in the neck, you don't do them. I think Modulators is going to open up a lot of possibilities for this, for making interesting, subtle changes or interactions between different elements of your mix. And also, it allows you to expand the capacity of, in particular, synthesizers, but also effects, because you can add LFOs, you can add audio reactivity, etc. I'm not going to say the possibilities are endless, but the possibilities are certainly significant, and there's a lot of stuff you can do. I think this is the kind of thing that You'll only really get into it and be able to really find what's possible with it after a bit of experimentation with it and finding the kind of things that you want to do. So in the same way, dynamic EQs make a lot of mixing tasks a lot easier, and having compression with side chaining means you can automate elements of a mix without having to literally draw in automation. Modulators are going to do the same kind of thing. For me, they're going to become indispensable, and I'm going to need to make sure that anyone I'm working with has the right version of Cubase to do that kind of thing with, although, of course, there are ways around that with burning things down to audio, etc. But that's by the by. Ultimately, I think this is the most exciting feature of Cubase 14, certainly for me, because it's got so much potential and will enable me to do so many things that previously I've gone, not sure. Now I probably will go, yeah, because it's 10 seconds and then it's going to just work and it's not going to stitch me up in other ways, which many other things would have done. As ever, hope you found this useful. And if you have, please like, subscribe, comment, and watch every video that I've ever made from the beginning of time until now on repeat for the next couple of months, because that would really help me out. Anyway, hope you found this useful, and we'll see you again soon-ish for more Music Tech Tuition.